Good morning, everyone. It's Thursday, and have I got an exciting story for you today? We've been going through a book called The 100 Bible Verses That Made America, and basically chronicling how God used his word and used people that are followers of him to impact America. Today's story comes from right in the midst of the Civil War. And I love it so much because we're going to see God answer prayer in an amazing way. And the evidence of that prayer, you can go visit today. Although you'd have to go to Georgia to do that, but you could go visit it today. And I'll tell you where it is. And we'll actually see a picture or so of it. During the Battle of the Wilderness, about halfway through the Civil War, one of the soldiers who later recorded his experiences, and it's why we know his name, John Mayle, Maile, a Union soldier, was captured. And then they put him on a cattle car and took him to the infamous POW camp in Andersonville, Georgia. Now, this place was so well known because its conditions were terrible. Terrible. Why? Because unlike what you see behind me, which is wide open spaces, it was a cramped prison type camp that was obviously outdoors. It was made the fort, it was a fort really to house 10,000 prisoners. They crammed 30,000 prisoners into that small area. It was jammed. But that wasn't even the worst of it. No, the worst of it was that there was no drinkable water. There was a small brook that ran through the meadow, but that's where those 30,000, that's all the water that they had. It's where they drank, washed, and used as a latrine. In fact, it was downstream from the Confederate Army camp. And honestly, they used it that way too, by the time it even got to them. And it became, well, they called it, John in his later book, called it a cesspool, a cesspool which boundless swarms of flies settled down and laid their eggs. The odor could be detected from miles away. A terrible water famine set in, and it just, he called them insane from water deficiency. Hundreds of men were dying. They couldn't live like that. Well, one day, one of the soldiers, a man who had been the chaplain, his name was Shepherd from Columbus, Ohio. He'd been a preacher before the war, and he was just sitting on a tree stump. And he started to sing the doxology. And soon, many of the men heard it, and they started singing the doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. And he had read a verse. And this can be our verse. It's a different verse for the day, but it comes from the book of Numbers. And he said, and it says this, Numbers chapter 20 at verse 11. You'll remember the story. Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly. Remember when Moses struck the rock and God provided the water when the Israelites were totally thirsty themselves? In fact, they were upset with God that he had brought them into the wilderness to die of thirst. But obviously God did not do that. He did bring them into the wilderness, but it was to show his glory and power. And so they read this verse, and that day that they were singing the doxology, they talked about that verse. And it was a perfect text for those thirsty men, many of whom, like I say, were dying. Somebody said, will the brother from Chicago lead us in prayer? And that started a prayer time that was one man after another prayed to the God in heaven that, hey, God, just as you did for the Israelites, we need water to drink or we're going to die. And then they got the idea that from that prayer meeting, and that only lasted about an hour. However, they decided they are going to pray constantly until God answers that prayer. And so for a couple of days they prayed. And then one morning as they awoke, and here's the quote from the book, an ominous stillness pervaded nature. By mid-morning, black clouds began rolling in, and the camp was deluged by a long-lasting cloudburst. And he recalled in his memoir, Natl did, they broke over our heads, and flashes of lightning swirled around us as the air was filled with short circuits. As the mighty deluge swept over the clearing and west of the prison, we bowed our head in preparation of being submersed in water. It was like a million buckets of water being poured over us at once. But here's the amazing thing. When the storm, that one-day storm wouldn't last them. But when it was over, somebody yelled out, a spring, a spring. The vent of spring poured crystal waters which shot up in the air in a column, and falling like a fan-like spray went babbling down the grade. Can you imagine just putting yourself in that position? Nearby prisoners described how during the storm, a lightning bolt had struck inside the prison, releasing the underground spring. Wow. It was as dramatic as Moses striking the rock. A trough was built, bringing endless supply of water to the prisoners, and the spring still gurgles to this day. That spring, can you picture the lightning bolt coming down, hitting the ground? It was as if God smote the ground, just like Moses did, but this time it was God with his lightning bolt, unleashing torrents of water. Fantastic. And the reason I love this so much, right now in Andersonville, Georgia, there is a thing called the National Prisoner of War Museum. And if you go to that museum, you can walk over to a stone shelter where a thing called Providence Spring is still there. It's still flowing. And it has an inscription on it. And you know what that inscription says? God smote the hillside and gave them drink. August 16th, 1864. Numbers 20:11, inscribed on stone in a national museum that you can still visit today. Isn't that a blessing? Wow. I love it. God is so good. He cared about his people, even behind those prison walls, allowed them to drink. Fantastic. Don't forget, our monthly food pantry is tomorrow at 9 a.m. to 10:30. We would love to be a blessing in your life. Just drive in, and we will put food in your car, a lot of food. God bless. Have a great day. Walk closely with your Lord.
And I won't worry about tomorrow. I'm trusting what you say.